It was supposed to be just another quiet weekend while my husband was away. But when my ex showed up out of the blue, something inside me shifted. Before I knew it, I asked him to do something I'd never imagined, and what happened next changed everything between us. It started first with the silence in the house that was deafening without Lucas. Here, everything seemed to echo the ticking of the clock, the creak of the floorboards, even my own breathing. My husband had left for a week-long business trip, as he often did, and I'd waved him off with the usual smiles and reassurances. "Don't worry, I'll be fine," I'd said. But as the hours passed, the quiet seeped into me like a shadow. I wasn't fine. I hadn't been fine for a while, and then the message came. It had been years since I'd heard from David, years of bearing memories of us together. Trying to convince myself I'd moved on, I told myself I'd forgotten the way his smile could light up a room, the way his touch could make me feel alive in a way no one else ever had. And yet, when I saw his name flash across my screen, my heart betrayed me, skipping a beat as though it had been waiting for this moment. "It's been a long time, Lily. I'm in town. Can we meet?" The text was simple, unassuming, but it hit me like a freight train for a moment. I thought about ignoring it. I was married. Now I had built a life with Lucas, a safe, comfortable life. But as I stared at the words on the screen, the walls of that carefully constructed life began to feel like a cage. Before I knew what I was doing, I had typed a response. "Come by tomorrow night," and now here I was, standing in front of the mirror, my hands trembling. As I adjusted the red silk dress I hadn't worn in years, it hugged my body in all the right places. A far cry from the practical, understated wardrobe I usually chose this. Wasn't how a married woman was supposed to dress? Wah, SS, it. But tonight wasn't about Lucas. Tonight was about something I couldn't quite name, but couldn't deny either. The doorbell rang sharp and sudden, pulling me out of my thoughts. My heart raced as I walked to the door, my heels clicking against the wooden floor. I paused for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Was this a mistake? Should I turn him away? Pretend I wasn't home? But then I thought about the years of what-ifs, the nights. I had wondered what might have been if things had gone differently. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. David stood there, and for a moment it felt like the years melted away. He looked older. Of course. There were a few more lines on his face, a touch of gray in his hair. But the essence of him was the same. The intensity in his green eyes, the easy confidence in his posture, the way his presence seemed to fill, the space around him. It all came rushing back. "Lily!" he said, his voice low and warm the way I remembered it. "You look stunning." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, my stomach twisting in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "David." I managed my voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time." He smiled, that same smile that had once made me feel like I could conquer the world too long. I stepped aside and he walked in his movements, slow and deliberate, as if he were giving me time to adjust to his presence. But there was no adjusting to David. He was a force, and being near him again felt like standing too close to a flame. The door clicked, shut behind us, and suddenly the house didn't feel so empty anymore. It felt alive, charged with an energy I hadn't felt in years. "You've done well for yourself," David said, glancing around the living room. His eyes lingered on the photos on the mantel, pictures of Lucas and me on our wedding day, smiling at the camera, looking every bit the perfect couple. I wondered what he was thinking, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned back to me, his gaze softening. "You seem happy." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken questions. Was I happy? I wanted to say yes, to assure him that I had moved on, that my life was everything I'd ever wanted. But the truth caught in my throat, refusing to come out. "I'm fine," I said instead, my voice carefully neutral. "Life is steady." David's lips twitch as though he could see right through me. "Steady." He repeated, his tone light, but his eyes piercing. "That doesn't sound like the Lily." I knew I felt a pang of something. I couldn't quite name nostalgia, maybe, or regret. People change. I said quietly, looking away. You know that, do they? He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a softer tone, because I don't think you have. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. David, why are you here? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out his fingers, brushing a strand of hair from my face. The touch was light, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me that I hadn't felt in years. I wanted to see you, he said simply. I couldn't come back to this town and not see you. His words were so sincere, so unguarded, that they left me breathless for years. I had told myself that what we had was in the past, that it didn't matter anymore, but now, standing here with him, I wasn't so sure. You shouldn't have come, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Maybe not. He admitted, his eyes searching mine, but I'm here now. The silence between us was deafening, thick with everything we weren't saying. I thought about Lucas, about the life we had built together, and for a moment, guilt twisted in my chest. But then I thought about the nights I had lain awake, wondering what might have been if I had chosen differently, if I had chosen David. I took a step back, needing space to breathe. Do you want to drink? I asked, desperate to break the tension. David nodded his gaze, never leaving me sure. I walked to the kitchen, my heels clicking against the floor, and poured 2 glasses of wine. My hands trembled slightly as I passed him a glass, and our fingers brushed for a moment. The contact was brief, but it was enough to send my pulse racing to old friends. David said, raising his glass. I hesitated, my eyes locking with his 2 old friends. I echoed. Though the words felt hollow, we both knew we were more than that. We sipped our wine in silence, the unspoken tension between us growing with every passing second. I couldn't help but steal glances at him. At the way his shirt stretched across his broad shoulders. At the way his lips curved around the rim of the glass. He was the same David I had fallen for all those years ago, and yet there was something different about him now, something that made him even harder to resist. You've changed, he said, suddenly breaking the silence. I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. Everyone changes, not like this. He set his glass down, his gaze steady and unyielding. The Lily I knew would never settle for steady. She would have fought for what she wanted. I felt my throat tighten, his words cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. Maybe I don't know what I want anymore. David stepped closer, his eyes never leaving mine. I think you do, he said quietly. You're just afraid to admit it. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare up at him, caught in the pull of something I couldn't name. And then, before I could stop myself, I whispered the words I had been holding back. I missed you. David's expression softened, and for a moment, I thought he might pull away. But instead, he reached out his hand, cupping my cheek. I missed you too, he said, his voice low and raw, and just like that, the distance between us disappeared. David's touch was like fire, and I burned for it the moment his hand brushed my cheek. A flood of emotions I had tried to suppress for years came crashing down. I wasn't just breathless. I was alive, truly alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long. Lucas's name flickered faintly in my mind, like a dying ember, but it wasn't enough to stop me. It wasn't enough to pull me away from the man standing in front of me. David's lips brushed mine, tentative teasing like he knew I was unraveling. I clung to the last shreds of restraint, but the instant his hand slipped to the small of my back, pulling me closer, I was gone. I melted into him, into the kiss, into everything I had spent years pretending. I didn't want. My hands found their way to his chest, his shoulders desperate to anchor myself, but all they did was pull him closer. When we finally broke apart, I was gasping, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. David's forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my skin. His hands stayed firm on my waist, grounding me in a moment I didn't want to end. I've missed you. I whispered, my voice trembling. The words spilled out before I could stop them, raw and unfiltered. David smiled that infuriating perfect smile that had haunted my dreams for years. "I missed you too," he murmured, his eyes locked onto mine, and I felt like he could see straight into my soul more than you'll ever know. I wanted to tell him that I had tried to move on, that I had built a life with Lucas, that I had convinced myself I was happy, but the words felt hollow, meaningless compared to the way my body ached for him, the way my heart beat. Faster just being near him. David. I said his name like a prayer, like a confession. My hands trembled as they traced the outline of his jaw, committing every detail of him to memory. "What are we doing? What we've always wanted to do?" he replied, his voice steady, certain. "We're just finally admitting it." He was right. God, he was right. I had spent years pretending that what we had was over, that I was content with my steady, predictable life, but now standing here with him, I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I wanted him. I wanted him in a way that made my knees weak, my chest tight, my mind utterly incapable of rational thought. I reached for him again, my fingers tangling in his hair as our lips met in a kiss. That was anything but gentle. It was desperate, hungry, like we were trying to make up for all the time we had lost. His hands slid over my body, exploring, claiming, and I shivered under his touch. "Lily," he said. My name, like it was sacred, pulling back just enough to look into my eyes. I've been waiting for this moment for so long. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, a mixture of longing and guilt twisting in my chest. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I've tried so hard to forget you, but I can't. I never could." "You don't have to do anything," he said, his hand cupping my face. "Just let yourself feel. Let yourself be who you are with me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. I had spent years trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect woman, bearing the part of me that craved something more. But now, in David's arms, I felt like that part of me was finally waking up. I pressed my lips to his again, my hands roaming over his chest, his shoulders desperate to feel every inch of him. He responded in kind, his touch growing bolder, more insistent, and I felt my body flush with heat. I didn't care about the consequences. I didn't care about anything, but the way he made me feel alive, wanted, loved. "God, Lily," he groaned against my lips. "You have no idea how much I've missed you, how much I've thought about this." His words made my heart race, and I clung to him, even tighter. "I've thought about it too." I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "Every day. Every night I've tried to push it away, but I can't." David pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, then "Stop fighting it," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Stop pretending you don't want this." I stared at him, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. He was right. I couldn't fight it anymore. I didn't want to. My hands slid down his chest, my fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as I pulled him closer. "I don't care anymore," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I just want you." The words were barely out of my mouth before he was kissing me again, his hands roaming over my body with a desperation that mirrored my own. I felt like I was drowning in him, in the intensity of his touch, the way he made me feel like I was the only thing that mattered. We stumbled toward the couch, our movements frantic, uncoordinated, as we lost ourselves in each other. I didn't care about anything but the way he made me feel, the way he looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. As he lowered me onto the cushions, his lips never leaving mine, I felt a sense of inevitability wash over me. This was what I had been missing, what I had been yearning for without even realizing it. And now that I had it, I didn't want to let it go. But as the heat between us grew, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. Lucas, my husband, the man who had given me everything, who trusted me implicitly. The guilt clawed at me, but it wasn't enough to stop me, not now. Not when David was here, filling the void I hadn't even realized was there. "Are you sure about this?" David asked, his voice low and husky, as he pulled back just enough to meet my gaze. I nodded, my hands trembling as they cupped his face. "I've never been more sure of anything thing," I whispered, and with that, the last of my resolve crumbled. The heat of the moment should have been fleeting, but it wasn't. I woke up the next morning in a tangle of limbs and sheets. The weight of David's arm draped over my waist. For a second, I forgot where I was, who I was. Then reality slammed into me, and with it came the tidal wave of guilt. I stared at the ceiling, my chest heavy, my mind reeling with the consequences of what I had done. But even as shame twisted in my gut, I couldn't ignore the glow beneath it, the undeniable satisfaction of feeling alive again. David stirred beside me, his lips brushing against my shoulder as he murmured my name. His voice was low, groggy, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "Good morning," he said, his arm tightening around me. His warmth was intoxicating, his presence so overwhelming that for a moment I let myself melt into it. "Morning," I replied softly, though my voice lacked the confidence I wanted it to have. David propped himself up on one elbow, his green eyes studying me intently. "You're thinking too much," he said, a teasing smile playing on his lips. "I can see it." I rolled onto my side, facing him. How could I not? David, what I did. It was wrong. His smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet determination. "It didn't feel wrong to me," he said simply. "It felt like everything I've been waiting for." His words hit me like a punch to the chest. I wanted to believe him, to let myself sink into the fantasy he was offering. But reality loomed over us like a dark cloud, and no matter how much I wanted to ignore it, I couldn't. "I'm married," I said, my voice cracking. "Lucas, he trusts me. He doesn't deserve this." David reached out his hand, brushing against my cheek. "And do you deserve to live a life that doesn't make you happy?" he asked softly. "Because I see you, Lily. I see the way you've buried yourself in this safe little world. But you're not happy, not really." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I hated how easily he could see through me. "You don't know what it's like." I whispered to feel torn like this. David sighed, his fingers trailing down my arm. "You're right, I don't. But I do know one thing. I've never stopped loving you, and I don't think you've stopped loving me either." His words cut through me like a blade, and I felt my defenses crumbling all over again. I hated him for being right. I hated myself even more for wanting to believe him. But most of all, I hated the part of me that had never let go of him, even after all these years. "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to fix this." David leaned in his forehead, resting against mine. "Maybe it doesn't need to be fixed," he murmured. "Maybe this is exactly where you're supposed to be." His lips found mine, and for a moment, I let myself get lost in him again. It was so easy to forget everything else when I was with him, to forget the guilt, the consequences, the life I was supposed to have. But the moment our kiss ended, the weight of reality came crashing down again. "I need time," I said, pulling away. "I need to figure this out." David nodded, though I could see the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Take all the time you need," he said softly. "I'm not going anywhere." His words were meant to comfort me, but they only made me feel worse. I climbed out of bed, wrapping the sheet around me. As I gathered my thoughts, the room felt suffocating, and I needed space, needed air. "I'm going to make coffee," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. David didn't stop me. He just watched as I slipped out of the room, his gaze heavy with emotions. I couldn't begin to untangle. The kitchen was quiet, the morning sunstream ing through the windows as I brewed a pot of coffee. My hands trembled as I poured myself a cup, the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I thought about Lucas, about the life we had built together, the trust I had shattered in a single night. How could I ever look him in the eye again? How could I ever pretend that everything was okay? But then I thought about David, the way he made me feel, the way he had always made me feel. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though. That was undeniable. It was the way he saw me, the way he understood me in a way Lucas never could with David. I didn't have to pretend, I didn't have to be the perfect wife, the perfect woman. I could just be me. I sipped my coffee, the warmth doing little to soothe the storm raging inside me. I knew I couldn't stay in this limbo forever. I had to make a choice, but no matter which path I chose, someone was going to get hurt. The sound of footsteps pulled me out of my thoughts, and I turned to see David standing in the doorway. He was wearing his jeans from the night before, his shirt unbuttoned, revealing the toned chest I had traced with my fingers just hours ago. He looked so at ease, so natural, like he belonged here. The sight of him made my heart ache. "Hey," he said, his voice soft as he stepped into the kitchen. "You okay?" I nodded, though the tears threatening to spill over told a different story. "I don't know what to do," I admitted. "I feel like I'm losing my mind." David walked over to me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "You're not losing your mind," he said. "You're just finally letting yourself feel again." His words broke something in me, and before I knew it, I was crying, the tears spilling down my cheeks. In a torrent of emotion, David pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I sobbed against his chest. "It's okay," he murmured, his hand stroking my hair. "It's okay. Lily, I've got you." And for a moment, it was okay. For a moment, I let myself believe that everything would work out, that I could have him without losing everything else. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The rest of the day passed in a blur. David stayed with me, his presence both comforting and overwhelming. We talked, we laughed, we reminisced about the past. It was so easy to fall back into the rhythm we had once shared, to pretend that nothing else mattered. But as the sun began to set, reality started creeping back in. I couldn't ignore the fact that Lucas would be home in a few days. I couldn't ignore the fact that this, whatever this was, couldn't last forever. "I should go," David said, his voice heavy with reluctance. We were sitting on the couch, my head resting on his shoulder, his arm wrapped around me. I looked up at him, my chest tightening at the thought of him leaving. "Do you have to?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. David cupped my face in his hands, his eyes searching mine. "I don't want to," he admitted, "but I think you need some time to figure things out." I nodded, though the thought of him walking out that door made my heart ache. "Will I see you again?" I asked, the vulnerability in my voice, making me cringe. David smiled, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You couldn't keep me away if you tried," he said, his tone soft but filled with certainty. He kissed me one last time, slow and tender, as if trying to make it last. And then he was gone, leaving me alone in the silence of my house. As I sat on the couch, staring at the empty doorway, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I had crossed a line I could never uncross, and now I was standing at a crossroads, torn between the life I had built and the man who made me feel alive. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The silence in the house felt different, now no longer comforting, no longer peaceful. It was oppressive, clinging to me like a shadow. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside the window reminded me of what I'd done, of the line I'd crossed. The scent of David lingered faintly in the air, a cruel reminder of the man who had walked out of my door hours ago. Lucas would be home tomorrow. The thought made my chest tighten, my stomach churn with guilt. I had spent the last day lost in a haze of desire, letting myself believe that I could have David without consequence. But now the weight of reality was crashing down on me. I had betrayed the man who had given me everything, and I wasn't sure I could ever look him in the eye again. I paced the living room, my thoughts racing. My phone sat on the coffee table, taunting me with its silence. David hadn't called or texted since he left, and part of me hated him for it. He had left me to face the aftermath alone, to deal with the wreckage of what we'd done. But wasn't that what I wanted time to think? To figure out how to put the pieces of my life back together? I sat down on the couch, my head in my hands. I needed to make a decision. I needed to figure out what I wanted, who I wanted, before Lucas came home. But every time I tried to imagine a future without David, my chest ached, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. The sound of my phone vibrating startled me, and I grabbed it quickly, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought it might be David. But when I looked at the screen, it was Lucas's name that stared back at me. I hesitated before answering, my hand trembling. "Hi," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, sweetheart," Lucas said, his voice warm and familiar. "I just wanted to check in and let you know I'll be home a little earlier than planned. My last meeting got canceled, so I'll be there tonight. The word hit me like a punch to the stomach. I wasn't ready to face him, wasn't ready to pretend that everything was normal. "That's great," I managed to say, forcing a smile. "He couldn't see what time should I expect you." "Around 8, he replied. "I can't wait to see you. I've missed you." Guilt twisted in my chest, sharp and unforgiving. "I've missed you too." I lied. We said our goodbyes, and I set the phone down, my hands shaking. I glanced at the clock. 4 hours. I had 4 hours to figure out how to face him, how to hide the betrayal written all over my face. But even as I tried to focus on Lucas, my thoughts kept drifting back to David. The way he had looked at me, the way he had touched me, the way he had made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered. How could I go back to my old life after that? How could I pretend that nothing had changed? I grabbed my phone again, my fingers hovering over David's name and my contacts. I wanted to call him, to hear his voice, to feel some kind of connection to him. But before I could make a decision, there was a knock at the door. My heart jumped and I froze. Lucas wasn't supposed to be home for hours. Slowly, I walked to the door, my mind racing with possibilities. When I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. David stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his expression uncertain. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice low. "I had to see you." Relief and fear flooded me in equal measure. "David, you shouldn't be here," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder as if Lucas might appear out of thin air. "I know," he said, stepping closer, "but I couldn't stop thinking about you, about us." His words sent a thrill through me, and I hated how much I wanted him to pull me into his arms to make me forget everything else. But Lucas's words echoed in my mind. "I'll be home tonight. You have to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Lucas will be here soon." David's jaw tightened, and I could see the frustration in his eyes. "Is that really what you want?" He asked for me to leave for us, to go back to pretending this never happened. I hesitated, my heart pounding. "I don't know what I want," I admitted. "I'm so confused." "David, I don't know how to fix this." "You don't need to fix anything," he said, his voice firm. "Just tell me the truth." "Lily, do you love him?" The question hit me like a slap, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Did I love Lucas? I wanted to say yes, to cling to the safety and stability he offered. But when I thought about love, real all-consuming love, it was David's face that came to mind. "I don't know," I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I don't know anymore." David stepped closer, his hands cupping my face. "I love you," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "I've always loved you, and I know you love me too. You don't have to say it. I can see it." His words broke something inside me, and I leaned into him, my lips finding his in a desperate kiss. For a moment, I let myself forget about everything else, the guilt, the consequences, the life I was about to destroy. All that mattered was him. But then the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment, and I pulled away, panic flooding my veins. "He's here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You have to go." David hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Lily, please," I begged, my voice trembling. "Just go." He stared at me for a moment, his eyes filled with hurt and longing. Then he nodded, stepping back. "I'll go," he said. "But this isn't over, Lily. I'm not giving up on us." I watched as he walked away, disappearing into the fading light. My heart ached with every step he took, but I forced myself to close the door to turn my back on him. A moment later, the front door opened and Lucas stepped inside. A smile, lighting up his face. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, pulling me into a hug. "It's so good to be home." I clung to him, my chest tightening with guilt and regret. "I missed you," I said, the words hollow as I buried my face in his shoulder. I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I had made a mess of everything and I didn't know how to fix it. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.